Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Of course, China faces very tough internal challenges, including the systemic economic and political components of structural slowdown. In addition to this, it faces an increasingly hostile and unstable international environment, in part in response to its own assertive behavior in recent years. One of the great wildcards in this external environment going forward will of course be the incoming second Trump administration. We have already looked at the security side of this potential relationship. Speculation continues, however, of just what the trade policy will look like. The United States could impose nearly 40% tariffs on imports from China early next year. A UK-based Reuters poll of economists published yesterday showed, potentially slicing growth in the world's second largest economy by up to 1 percentage point. The poll also predicts that the president-elect will resist starting off with a blanket 60% tariff on all Chinese goods, which could shave 2 to 2.5% of China's GDP growth. If Trump does go forward with this plan, however, an election promise, as China is largely reliant on trade as one of the few sources of healthy growth, this could well spell the end of Chinese growth as we have known it. One of the biggest variables about the new administration's trade policy towards China remains the question of whether or not there will be a role for Robert Lighthizer, Trump's trade negotiator from his first administration and a prominent China hawk. US-based Politico writes today that the possibility of a Lighthizer's snub on Wednesday restarted a pressure campaign from figures across the political spectrum in the US who have been critical on the consensus around free trade in Washington for decades. Matthew Skutz, founder of the populist right magazine Compact, penned a New York Times op-ed pleading with Trump to bring back the former trade chief to a cabinet role. And Peter Harrell, President Joe Biden's former international trade advisor, also endorsed a Lighthizer return, writing on X that Lighthizer, quote, has vision, is skilled at managing government, gets negotiations, and knows how to use things like exclusions to mitigate some unintended harms, end quote. Politico explains that not picking Lighthizer for a top economic role, quote, would be a signal that Trump may not follow through on the aggressive trade proposals he made a centerpiece of his campaign, like a 20% across-the-board tariff and duties at least 3 times higher on China, end quote. Lighthizer and his team were instrumental in crafting those ideas and have been working behind the scenes to prepare executive orders to carry out such tariff increases as well as the economic justification for them. Meanwhile, political attention has been placed on Trump's commerce pick, investment banker Howard Lutnick, due to his exposure to China. The financial services firms helmed by Lutnick have profited from ties to China. The financial ties raise questions about whether Lutnick could be unduly influenced by Beijing when making decisions about whether to impose fresh tariffs and export curbs on China. Democratic Senator Ron Wyden, who chairs the Senate Finance Committee, expressed this week, quote, Mr. Lutnick's conflicts of interest in China appear to be substantial. How can the American people expect someone who is on the Chinese government's payroll to help level the playing field with China for working Americans? End quote. Now, while we're on US-China, we note that the PRC Minister of Defense has declined a meeting with the US Secretary of Defense during the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus. The PRC Ministry of Defense spokesperson said that this was because of recent US arms sales to Taiwan and that it is, quote, entirely the responsibility of the US side. End quote. Chinese Defense Minister Admiral Dong Jun attended and delivered a speech at the 11th ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus held in Laos yesterday morning. Next up, UK-based The Financial Times has published a long piece about how Fang Fenglei, a Chinese investment banker who founded private equity firm Hopu Investment and is the chairman of Goldman Sachs Guohua Securities, outplayed Goldman Sachs when they picked him as their local partner in a financial structure designed to get around PRC laws banning foreign control of finance firms. Let's examine some of the piece. In the early 2000s, Hank Paulson traveled extensively to China seeking access to the country's financial markets for Goldman Sachs, where he was chief executive. The investment bank's top brass believed the deal he eventually cut would only be a temporary one. The thinking was that an alliance with Fang Fenglei would endure for only a few years until the Wall Street institution was permitted to directly own its securities and investment banking business in China. But instead, the arrangement lasted for almost 2 decades. During that time, the economic benefits flowed mainly to Fang, leaving Goldman desperate to unwind the deal. One former Goldman banker reportedly told the outlet, quote, "We rented his name, but we chose someone who tried to screw us in the end." End quote. Interviews with more than a dozen of Fang's associates and bankers and hundreds of pages of documents show how Goldman's partner wove himself into the fabric of the bank's Chinese operations and forced it to pay far more than it had expected to gain full ownership of the business. Now quoting the Financial Times, quote, "The 2004 contract created a complex call option formula for the price Goldman hoped to pay to buy the businesses, which Goldman expected would be equivalent to a net annual return in the single-digit millions of dollars to Fang and his partners. Fang wanted $250 million. End quote. Veteran China analyst Bill Bishop observed on this story earlier this week, quote, "You have to respect someone like Fang who squeezed Goldman and top executives like Hank Paulson for far more than they expected, because they did not understand how things really worked in China. Fang at one point was one of the most connected financiers in Beijing due to his close ties with Wang Qishan, the godfather of the PRC financial sector. There had been rumors recently that he was under political pressure, but he is now a regular on the conference circuit. His former CEO, Zhang Hongli, who tried to oust Fang in a coup, is going to jail, and his PE firm, Hopu, is raising another fund." End quote. Next up, Beijing is in a very awkward position with our next development to cover, but just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing is a tremendous help for the channel. It's the only way in which this channel can grow. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to go the extra mile and help me keep the channel financially sustainable. Thank you so much. Let's continue. And finally for today, UK-based energy policy think tank Carbon Brief, in a new report published this week, argues that, incredibly, China's historical carbon emissions in 2023 overtook the EU's. That means that now China, which has only in recent decades industrialized, has now produced more carbon emissions than the European Union going all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. Put another way, China's historical emissions within its borders have now caused more global warming than the 27 member states of the EU combined. Carbon Brief's analysis shows that 94% of the global carbon budget for 1.5 Celsius has been used up, as cumulative emissions since 1850 have reached 2,607 billion tons of carbon dioxide. While developed countries have used the majority of this budget, the analysis shows that China's historical emissions reached 312 billion tons of carbon dioxide in 2023, overtaking the EU's 303 billion tons of carbon dioxide. China is still far behind the 532 billion tons emitted by the US, however, according to the analysis. Indeed, according to the report, China is unlikely to ever overtake the US contribution to global warming based on current policies. In addition, China's per capita emissions are about 1/3 that of the EU's. Nevertheless, the findings of this report are very timely. This week, diplomats and leaders from nearly 200 countries are gathering at the United Nations Climate Summit at Baku, Azerbaijan, to discuss how to raise the trillions of dollars that vulnerable nations will need to shift to clean energy and to cope with droughts, heat waves, floods, and other hazards of the warming planet. One big question is where that money should come from. As the US-based New York Times writes this week, quote, "Traditionally, the answer has been that wealthy industrialized countries like the United States, Japan, Canada, Australia, and most of Western Europe should pay up. Under a United Nations framework originally written in 1992, these developed countries have been called upon to provide financial aid. Countries like China, India, and Saudi Arabia, as well as every nation in Africa, are classified as developing by that framework and have not been required to chip in. Today, however, many wealthy nations say this distinction no longer makes sense." End quote. Thus, this report's findings are very much inconvenient for Beijing, which reportedly remains very stubborn. As US-based Bloomberg writes today, quote, "A major stumbling block has been China's status as both a developing nation in diplomatic categories set by UN climate negotiations, as well as the world's second-largest economy and dominant producer of green technologies. The Chinese team has drawn a red line at being classified as an official donor country under the Paris Agreement." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Friday, and I will see you all tomorrow.